on Please Convince Me Television. My name is Jim Wallace. Today I'd like to talk about the issue of unanswered prayer. If there is a God, why doesn't He consistently answer the prayer of His followers? There are many deserving, devout Christians who pray to God and seem to have their prayers go unanswered. And does unanswered prayer serve as an evidence that the God of the Bible simply doesn't exist? Well, in order to answer this objection, we've got to understand something about God's priorities. While it's true that many prayers seem to go unanswered, this perception is probably based on the fact that the only answer we would find acceptable to prayer is yes. That's not how it works with God. God answers all of our prayers. No prayer goes unanswered. Sometimes the answer is yes, but sometimes the answer is no. And sometimes the answer is simply not yet. Now, in order to understand why a particular prayer might fall into one of these three categories, it might be helpful to look at those prayers that God always answers in the affirmative. God always says yes to our requests for wisdom, forgiveness, and salvation. We see this quite clearly in James 1:5, First John 1:9, and Romans 10:13. Now, why would this be so? Why would God always say yes to these kinds of prayers? Well, you may have noticed that these types of prayers are far more concerned about your character in light of eternity than they are with your comfort in light of our mortality. This is the key to understanding why it is that God answers prayer the way He does. God responds to those prayers that help us to understand His priorities, prayers that result in our character development, our appreciation of God's power, our recognition of the eternal nature of our lives. Now, some prayers clearly do get answered in the negative, but these prayers fall into two categories. There are clearly some prayers that are denied by God because they violate God's nature as the perfect source of truth and righteousness. I've arrested many murderers who, after they were in custody, prayed desperately that they would be found innocent on a particular charge, or that the prosecutor or the lead detective would somehow mysteriously die. God's not going to answer those kinds of prayers in the affirmative because they violate His sense of justice and mercy. Now, while those things may actually happen, you can be certain that they're not the result of God answering prayer. But what about the righteous prayers that God doesn't seem to answer? Well, these prayers are not yet prayers. God will in fact say yes to these requests, but He might not respond in our desired timing. Not yet prayers are sometimes answered in this life, and not yet prayers are sometimes not answered until the next life. Our impatience? That's simply the result of our mortal focus. We seldom think about how short this life will seem, especially when compared to eternity with God. It might seem like God is never going to answer yes. But when compared with eternity, this life is just a blink of an eye. It's a millisecond. These prayers are not yet prayers because God fully intends to answer them in eternity. In the meantime, God is answering prayers with specific goals in mind. First, does this help my child to understand who I am? Does this help my child to develop the kind of patience, love, or character that I want demonstrated on earth? Does this help my child to live for eternity rather than for the fleeting moments of his or her mortal life? Does this response that I'm about to provide help or hurt others who are watching to have a faith that is uncoerced? These are the big priorities to God. This is what God aims to do. These are God's goals and purposes. Look, God's priorities are different than our priorities. We want things now. We want things to satisfy our mortal existence. God is concerned about our character and eternity. His ways are not our ways. That's why it's written in the Bible in Isaiah 55, verses 8 and 9, where God says, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, nor are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." Thanks for joining us on Please Convince Me Television. Be sure to listen to our podcast and visit our website at pleaseconvinceme.com.